The first night began long before I closed my eyes. It started the moment I realized I was going to sleep in a place that didn't recognize my name, my voice, or the rhythm of my breathing. Even before the sun disappeared, something inside me felt different. It was a quiet kind of fear, the kind that doesn't shout or shake your hands, but sits behind your ribs and waits. I looked around the room and tried to convince myself it was temporary, that it wasn't really happening, but my heart knew it was real. The silence around me was not peaceful, it was unfamiliar, and it made every sound inside my mind feel louder than it should have been. I could hear the small things people never think about, like the slight buzz of a light bulb, the soft hum of something outside the window. Maybe a streetlight or a distant car. In my own home, those sounds blended into the background of life, but here they stood out, sharp and cold. I kept looking at the walls, the ceiling, the door, as if one of them would suddenly feel like mine. They didn't. They were strangers. And I felt like one too. The daylight outside faded slowly, but I still wasn't ready to lie down. I touched my bed, not to rest, but to test its softness, its smell, its weight. Even the blanket felt like it was asking me, "Who are you and why are you here?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know if I should pretend everything was fine or if I should let myself feel the fear that was already filling the room. The silence kept growing, stretching across the corners and crawling across the floor until I felt it wrapping around my ankles. I remembered the last night I spent in my own room. I didn't know it was the last night at the time. I didn't hug my pillow with extra care. I didn't look at the door in a special way. I didn't whisper anything to the walls. I just slept like it was any other night. Now I wished I had known. I wished I had taken one last long breath of the air that belonged to my memories. Instead, I was breathing air that didn't know me at all. That thought alone made the silence heavier than the darkness. When the lights finally went off, the fear found more space to move. My ears started searching for sounds of life, something familiar, something that could remind me I wasn't completely lost. But the quiet was so strong that even my heartbeat sounded like footsteps in the hallway. I tried to close my eyes, but every blink felt like a door shutting me in. Even the darkness of the room was different. At home, darkness had warmth. Here, it looked at me like a stranger. I sat on the bed and pulled my knees close because my body didn't know where else to find safety. I thought about reaching for my phone, not to call anyone, but just to feel like I still had a piece of my world in my hands. But even the screen felt distant, like it was glowing in a place I didn't belong yet. Fear doesn't always come with loud tears or shaking shoulders. Sometimes it arrives slowly and quietly, almost politely, and sits beside you without asking. That's how it felt that night. Time moved differently in that silence. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like a full day. My thoughts circled around simple things, like the sound of my mother's footsteps, the click of the kitchen door, the way someone always coughed before bedtime down the hallway. I never realized how much noise love makes. Here, love was far away and silence had taken its seat. I wasn't sure if I wanted to fight it or wait for it to soften. I lay down at last, not because I was comfortable, but because I was tired of sitting with my fear. The pillow was cold at first, then warm, then cold again, as if it too wasn't sure what to feel about me. I stared into the dark, listening to everything that wasn't there. No one called my name. No familiar footsteps crossed the floor. No doors closed gently in the distance. Just the deep, steady quiet of a place that didn't care who I was. I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and held my breath for a moment, just to feel something inside me that I could control. The silence waited. The fear stayed. The night did not answer any of the questions I didn't dare to speak. And still I lay there, wide awake, counting the beats of a heart that was trying to be brave in a world that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, and too far from everything I once thought would never change. That first night away from home didn't stay in the room with me alone. It brought all my memories with it, one by one, as if they refused to let me face the silence without them. The moment the world outside grew quieter, my mind opened the doors to everything I had left behind. I didn't call for those memories, but they came anyway, soft at first, then louder, like footsteps approaching from the past. I could almost hear the familiar sounds of my house, the gentle clatter of dishes in the kitchen, someone closing a cupboard, The quiet conversation of people who didn't need to speak loudly to feel heard. I imagined the light in my old room, not too bright, not too dark, the way it always slipped across the walls in the evening. At home, there was always some movement somewhere, a door opening, someone walking down the hall, the creak of a chair as someone stood up or sat down. All those sounds meant life and love and the comfort of belonging without asking for it. Now, in a place that didn't know my story, I had to lean on the memories to remember who I was. I saw my mother in my mind, the way she always checked my room before going to bed, pretending she was just passing by, but really looking in to make sure I was all right. She never asked if I needed anything, she just knew when I did. The rustle of her clothes, the soft sound of her voice calling my name from the next room, the gentle way she said goodnight without always saying the word. I thought of the blanket she would sometimes place over me if I fell asleep by accident. Here, no one knew the weight or warmth I was used to. The bed felt like it was waiting for someone else. My father's laughter came back next, the kind that didn't always need a reason. Sometimes he laughed just to lighten the air in the room, and I never realized until now how much that mattered. I could picture him sitting in his favorite chair, reading something quietly or fixing something that didn't really need fixing. He didn't talk much at night, but his presence filled every silence in a way that made it feel safe. In this strange place, every pause felt empty, not peaceful. I remembered the times when I would hear my parents talking in the other room, their voices calm but steady, sometimes tired, sometimes playful. Those conversations told me everything was normal, even when I didn't understand the words. I didn't think I would miss the sound of voices I wasn't part of, but that night I did. I missed hearing people I loved just being alive near me, without needing me to do anything at all. My siblings, if they were awake, would be arguing over something small, like who took the last snack or who touched whose things. I used to roll my eyes or tell them to be quiet, but even those noisy arguments had love hidden inside them. There was always someone to annoy, someone to laugh at, someone to lean on. Now there was just me and a room that didn't care what my name was or who I used to fight with over the remote. I could see the hallway of my house, the pictures on the walls, the way the floor felt under my feet. I remembered the smell of food in the evening, the sound of water running in the sink, the clinking of glasses during dinner. Even the simplest things, like the way someone would call out, "I'm home," when they walked in the door, came back to me with so much weight. I never knew silence could make memories so loud. I thought of the times I sat at the table doing something small while someone else moved around me, not needing to speak, but knowing I wasn't alone. I remembered the evenings we spent together without planning anything, when time felt softer and the night arrived slowly. I remembered the way someone would always tap on my door before entering, even if they knew I wouldn't mind. Here, doors stayed closed because no one knew I was behind them. I could picture the glow of the living room light from under my bedroom door, the familiar shadows, the faint noise of a TV show someone was watching half-heartedly. I remembered how home had a rhythm, a heartbeat shared by everyone inside it, and how I never had to question whether I was part of it. That night, lying in a room where nothing carried a memory of me, I reached for those moments not with my hands, but with my mind, trying to wrap them around myself like a second blanket. Even the air back home had its own story, the mix of cooking, soap, dust, and something warm I could never name but always felt. I didn't realize air could be different until I tried breathing in a place that had never held any of my tears or laughter. Every memory of home carried not just images, but sensations, the warmth of a hand on my shoulder, the sound of someone calling from the kitchen, the quiet way someone would check if my door was locked at night. I didn't know if the people I loved were thinking of me in that moment, but I knew I was carrying all of them with me, not because I wanted to remember, but because forgetting them even for a minute would have made the silence even louder. There is a moment in every night away from home when courage and loneliness meet each other in the same breath. They don't fight in loud ways, they don't shout or push, but they pull at different sides of the heart until you don't know which one is winning. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing and everything, trying to decide if I should be brave or let the sadness wash over me. Courage told me I had made a choice, that I had stepped into a new part of life, and that this was proof I was growing. Loneliness whispered that I wasn't ready, that growth wasn't supposed to hurt this much, that nobody had warned me about the quiet that follows bravery. I tried to sit up straight, like people do when they want to feel strong, but even my posture felt like a lie. My hands were cold, my breathing uneven, and I kept reminding myself that I had chosen this path for a reason. People always say courage is about moving forward, but they don't talk enough about the emptiness that sometimes walks beside it. I could feel that emptiness sitting next to me, silent but present, as if it had been waiting for this exact night to arrive. I thought about the things people tell you before you leave home. They say be brave, make us proud, this is your time to grow, don't worry, everything will be fine. They give you encouragement like small candles to carry with you, but they don't tell you how quickly those candles can flicker when the darkness is unfamiliar. I wanted to hold on to those words, to use them like armor, but loneliness kept finding cracks in the spaces between them. I stood up and walked around the room, pretending I was just stretching, but really I was trying to fill the silence with movement. The walls didn't care. The floor didn't understand. Everything around me felt untouched by the life I came from, and that made it harder to breathe. I told myself to be strong, to act like I belonged there, to remember that this was only the beginning, not the end. But every brave thought had a shadow behind it, reminding me that beginnings can feel like endings when the night is too quiet. I wondered if other people had felt the same on their first night alone. If they also sat with their hands clasped together like they were afraid of losing themselves in the dark. I imagined others lying in beds that were not theirs, listening to silence that held no history, and fighting back tears not because they were weak, but because they were human. There is a kind of courage that doesn't look like strength at all, the kind that sits with loneliness and doesn't try to escape it right away. I tried closing my eyes, but that only made the loneliness speak louder. It asked me questions I didn't know how to answer. Who will check if you are okay tonight? Who will hear you if you cry? Who will call your name if you don't wake up on time? Courage tried to respond with logic, with calm thoughts, with reminders of why I was there, but loneliness spoke the language of the heart, not the mind, and the heart listens more closely when the world is silent. I turned on the light for a moment, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I wanted proof that I wasn't disappearing. The light didn't comfort me, it only made the room look more like a stranger. I turned it off again and sat back down, telling myself that I just needed time, that tomorrow would feel different, that everyone struggles on their first night away. But even those thoughts felt heavy, like they were made of stone and not hope. At some point, I placed my hand over my chest just to feel the beat of my heart. It was uneven, not because I was scared of something outside, but because I was trying to hold on to something inside. Courage beat quietly along with it, not loud or heroic, just steady enough to remind me I hadn't given up. Loneliness wrapped itself around my fingers like cold air, telling me I was still alone. No matter how strong I pretended to be, there were moments that night when I almost convinced myself I was okay, that I could handle it, that I was stronger than the silence. But loneliness is patient. It doesn't need to rush. It waits in the pauses between breaths, in the spaces between thoughts, in the empty corners of a new room. And courage doesn't always chase it away. Sometimes courage just sits beside it and refuses to leave, even when it feels small and tired. I didn't cry right away, because part of me felt that tears would mean I was losing. But another part of me wondered if maybe crying was not the same as giving up. Maybe letting the sadness pass through me was also a kind of courage. The room stayed silent, not offering comfort, not offering resistance. It let the struggle happen quietly, the way the night often does when it knows there are some battles only the heart can feel and only time can witness. Sometimes change doesn't walk in like a storm. It arrives in a moment so small you almost miss it. That night, when fear and silence sat heavily around me, I didn't expect anything to shift. I thought the darkness would last until morning, untouched and unchanged. But life has a way of placing tiny lights in places you don't think to look. I was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling I could barely see, when a sound so soft I might have ignored it at home reached me. It wasn't loud, not sharp or startling, just a faint tapping from outside the window, like something gentle reminding me that the world was still moving. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind or a loose branch brushing against the glass. But the sound came again, steady, light, almost rhythmic. I turned my head, and for a moment I forgot to feel afraid. I just listened. There was nothing special about the sound itself, but in the quiet of that room it felt alive. It didn't know who I was or how I felt, but it broke the silence that had made me feel invisible. I stood up and walked to the window without thinking, drawn by something I couldn't name. The floor was cold under my feet, and the air near the window felt different, thinner somehow, like it carried a hint of the outside world. I pulled the curtain back just a little and saw the night in a way I hadn't looked at it before. The sky wasn't completely dark. There was a soft glow from somewhere far away, a streetlight maybe, casting a pale shimmer over the trees. The branches were moving gently, and each time they brushed against the window frame, that small sound returned. I opened the window a little, not all the way, just enough to feel the air. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't as cold as I expected either. It smelled different than the room, like open space and distant places. I took a breath without meaning to, and then another. Nothing dramatic happened, no sudden burst of courage, no voice from the sky telling me what to do. But something inside me loosened. The world outside that window didn't feel like it was closing in on me. It felt wide and quiet and strangely patient. I don't know how long I stood there, with one hand resting on the window frame and my thoughts calmer than before. I wasn't thinking about home in that moment, or the silence, or my fears. I was just there, breathing in air that didn't belong to my past or my memories, air that didn't ask anything from me. The loneliness had not disappeared, but it didn't feel as sharp. It sat beside me differently, like something that could be held instead of something that held me. I closed the window slowly and went back to the bed, but the room didn't feel entirely the same. The shadows were still there, the unfamiliar walls still stood around me, but the silence had changed shape. It wasn't heavy in the same way. I lay down again, not to sleep, but to rest. There is a difference, and that night I understood it. For the first time since I entered that room, I didn't feel like the darkness was pressing against me. I felt like maybe I could exist inside it without disappearing. As I settled back under the blanket, I remembered something small from home, not a grand memory, not a moment filled with strong emotion, just a quiet image of sitting near a window on a rainy day. The sound of raindrops tapping against the glass had always made me feel safe. I hadn't thought about that in so long. I realized the tapping outside the window that night reminded me of that, not because the sound was the same, but because it told me that the world beyond my fear still moved gently, still offered pieces of familiarity in ways I didn't expect. I looked up at the darkness above me and felt a strange kind of calm settle into my chest. Not peace, not joy, but something softer than panic. The room was still unfamiliar, but it no longer felt like it was swallowing me whole. A part of me, a very small part, began to believe that maybe I could learn to exist here, that maybe tomorrow would not feel as heavy as tonight. I didn't smile or speak or move much after that, but I noticed that my breathing had changed. It was steadier, quieter, almost like my body had decided on its own to let go of a little of the fear. The moment was small, so small that someone else might not understand why it mattered. But sometimes all it takes is the world reminding you, in the softest way, that you are still part of something bigger than your loneliness. That night, it wasn't strength or loud courage that reached me. It was a sound I could have ignored, a breath of air I didn't expect, a quiet reminder that, even in the deepest silence, not everything is standing still. I didn't know a single night could become a mirror. But that first night away from everything familiar showed me parts of myself I had never tried to see. I always believed I understood who I was because I lived surrounded by people who knew my name, my habits, my routines. At home, I never questioned my place because it was already there waiting for me. But that night, in a room where nothing recognized me, I realized how much of my identity had been shaped by the sounds, faces, and walls I left behind. It wasn't that I didn't know myself, it was that I had never met the version of me who stands alone without anything to lean on at first. I thought strength meant not feeling afraid, not missing anyone, not letting loneliness reach my heart. But as the night unfolded, I learned that strength isn't the absence of fear, it's the quiet decision to exist with it. I didn't break down the way I thought I might. I didn't run back to what was safe, even though my mind tried to convince me to. I stayed. I breathed through the uncertainty, even when each breath felt unfamiliar. In that stillness, I realized I wasn't as fragile as I once believed. I discovered that silence tests you in a way noise never can. At home, when I was confused or sad, there was always some distraction. A voice calling from another room, footsteps passing by, a door opening, a laugh somewhere down the hall. Those sounds carried me without me noticing. But that night, the silence gave me no place to hide. I had to face every thought, every fear, every memory without interruption. It was uncomfortable, almost sharp at times, but it showed me how much of my peace depended on things outside myself. I began to understand that real calm has to come from within, not from the presence of others. I learned that I carry more of my home inside me than I ever understood. Even when the room felt distant and cold, the memories that visited me were not there to hurt me, they were there to remind me of the love that shaped me. I realized that missing someone doesn't make you weak, it proves you have known connection deeply enough to feel its absence. I used to think depending on others made me less capable, but that night I began to see that love doesn't make you smaller. It builds something in you that you take wherever you go. The fear I felt in the beginning didn't disappear, but I noticed it changed shape. It no longer felt like something chasing me, but something sitting quietly, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I learned that fear doesn't always mean stop, sometimes it means listen. I listened to myself in a way I never had before. Without familiar voices to drown out my own, I heard my thoughts clearly, some of them kind, some of them harsh, some of them uncertain. And through those thoughts, I understood that bravery isn't loud or sudden. It grows slowly in the space between doubt and decision. I found out that I had expectations about myself I didn't even know were there. I thought I had to be strong the way people imagine strength, calm, untouched, certain. But that night showed me that strength can look like shaking hands and a trembling heart that still stays. It can look like wiping your eyes alone and not calling anyone even when you want to. It can look like lying in bed with fear beside you and still finding a way to breathe through the weight of it. I learned that identity is not only built in the places that feel safe, but in the moments that feel uncertain. Every time I wanted to give in to the panic and didn't, I was meeting a new version of myself. Someone who could feel lost and still not disappear. Someone who could cry quietly and still not fall apart. Someone who could hear the echo of their own heartbeat in a strange room and not mistake it for loneliness alone. I began to understand that being alone doesn't always mean being abandoned. Sometimes it means being given the space to see yourself without reflections from others. I had never realized how much I waited for other people to tell me who I was, through their comfort, their routines, their expectations. That night, with no one there to remind me, I started to ask myself the questions I had avoided. Who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when no one is close enough to catch me? Who am I when the only voice I can hear is my own? I didn't find all the answers. I didn't even know how to ask all the right questions. But I learned something small and important. I could survive my own silence. I could exist in a place that did not remember my past or carry my memories. I could sit with my fear and not let it take the whole room. I could feel the ache of missing people without collapsing under it. I could be uncertain and still remain present. That night didn't give me confidence in a sudden burst. It handed it to me piece by piece, in quiet breaths and steady moments. It showed me that I was not only the person shaped by comfort and company, but someone who could stand on unfamiliar ground and still belong to themselves. I didn't leave the night fearless or fully healed, but I left with a truth I had never held before. I was not as alone inside myself as I thought. Long after the first night ended, I carried it with me in ways I didn't understand at first. I thought it would fade like most difficult moments do, swallowed by routine and time, but instead it became something I returned to again and again. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed a part of me that I had never met before. That night didn't just pass, it planted something quiet inside me, something that kept growing even when I wasn't paying attention. I didn't wake up the next day stronger or wiser, but the world looked a little different, and slowly I began to understand why every new place I entered after that felt slightly less intimidating. Not because it was familiar, but because I had already survived the feeling of complete unfamiliarity. I knew what silence felt like when it had no memory of me. I knew what fear sounded like when no one else could hear it. I knew that the ache of being away from home didn't break me, even when it tried. So when I faced other uncomfortable moments, other rooms with unknown walls, other nights that felt uncertain, I carried a quiet reminder that I had already stood alone once and stayed standing. I also began to notice how I looked at other people differently. Before that night, I saw strangers as separate, distant, wrapped in their own stories that had nothing to do with mine. But after lying in that unfamiliar room with only my thoughts for company, I started to understand that everyone has a first night somewhere. Everyone has sat in silence, trying not to feel small. Everyone has carried memories like blankets when the world around them felt cold. I didn't have to know their stories to know they had them. The loneliness I felt made me softer toward the loneliness I couldn't see in others. The night also changed the way I understood strength. I stopped thinking it was something loud or visible, something that always showed up in confidence or courage people could see. I began to understand that strength sometimes looks like breathing quietly through fear, sitting with sadness instead of running from it, or letting yourself miss the people you love without letting that missing pull you backward. I learned that the world doesn't always reward this kind of strength, but it's the kind that keeps you moving when no one is watching. I carried new patience with myself too. Before that night, I rushed through moments of discomfort, trying to escape them as quickly as possible. But when you spend hours with only your thoughts and heartbeat to fill the space, you learn that some emotions won't be chased away by distractions. You either face them or carry them unfinished. After that, when fear or sadness returned in other moments of my life, I didn't panic as much. I recognized the feeling, like seeing a familiar shadow. I knew I could survive its presence, even if it stayed longer than I wanted. The memory of that night became a kind of quiet compass. Whenever I doubted myself, whenever I wanted to quit because something felt too heavy or too unknown, I would think back to the version of me who lay in the dark, trying to breathe through the weight of the silence. If I could stay there, awake and afraid and still unbroken, then I could face other things too. Not because they were easy, but because I had already learned I didn't fall apart as easily as I once imagined. That night also made me appreciate the presence of others in a deeper way. When I returned home or spoke with the people I loved again, I listened differently. I noticed small things, the way someone said my name, the way footsteps sounded in the hallway, the warmth in an ordinary conversation. The absence had made those details louder. And as new nights came in new places, I brought pieces of home with me, not in objects, but in the way I remembered tenderness, noise, laughter, and routine. As time passed, I didn't retell the story of that first night often. It wasn't the kind of thing people usually ask about, and I didn't need to speak it out loud for it to matter. But its presence shaped the choices I made. I said yes to things that scared me. I stayed in places that didn't feel comfortable right away. I trusted myself a little more than before. Whenever I faced a new beginning, I remembered that the first beginning was survived in silence, with nothing but a fragile heart and breath to keep me company. The night also taught me that growth doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always feel empowering when it's happening. Sometimes it feels like trembling in the dark, wishing for something familiar. But later, when you walk into another unknown place and don't crumble, you realize something changed quietly in you while you were trying not to fall apart. Even now, I don't think of that night as a story of suffering. I think of it as the night I met the part of myself that doesn't run. The part that sits in fear but keeps breathing. The part that holds on without knowing what tomorrow will feel like. That discovery didn't make the world easier, but it made me different in it. And long after the walls of that room faded from memory, the version of me that emerged from the darkness kept walking, a little steadier, a little braver, carrying a night no one else saw, but one that changed everything quietly from the inside.